1 2 1 1 1 2 1 2. 1 1 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2
everyone. Good morning. Thank you. Whilst people are coming in, I'm going to introduce Paul Sunderland. My name is Christophe Sarvine. I am one of the founder, director of ICAAD, and incidentally CEO. And yeah, Paul, I feel really, really held and supported by those sources, so thank you, by the way. We thought about different themes, Paul, and all of a sudden the idea of talking about adoption came up in our conversation. And that's the first time we addressed this theme at ICAAD over the last 4 years. And I don't know why, because I reckon it is one of the major wounds, even if it's life-saving, a human being can experience this as life. So Paul Sunderland today to tell us all about adoption. Paul has 35 years now of experience in the industry of getting people to heal their wound. I don't know why I say industry. And he has been also a great advocate of that, with many, many TED Talks conveying a language of wisdom and compassion about attachment, detachment, the pain of being human amongst other human, the pain of addiction. A lot of fantastic messages I always cherish. And on top of that, you're seeing many, many clients. So you're also practitioners, which is so important because we can drown ourselves into theory, right? And you've got a few co-therapists here. So the title Paul decided to give to this presentation is Relinquishment and Adoption, Understanding the Impact of an Early Psychological Wound. I'm not going to unveil that at all. I just want to say something here. We're talking about attachment today. We're talking about adoption, but why don't we gather a little bit to make that more attached? So if up to you, but if you want us to join the front rows, I think that'd be fantastic, because there's something I have to say. Your voice is central into what you have to say. Your energy is so important that the closest you are to Paul, the most you will benefit from his words. Am I overselling it now? Right. Okay, well, thank you so much. Warm welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we need to stop that. Those were my colleagues. And actually, I was rather enjoying this. I was feeling a bit sort of anxious, in the last sort of half hour. There was quite a bit of sort of limbic resonance. I was sitting at the back and just sort of looking at these guys that I know quite well and I work with quite a bit, and sort of soothing. And I'm a real believer in equine-assisted psychotherapy. Horses are experts in reading somatic signals. They pick up on respiration, heartbeat, muscle tension, and they teach boundaries, self-soothing, affect regulation, and all of that. So I thank them, and thank you for coming to this talk. I know some of you, which is quite nice. A bit of limbic resonance again, very important for me to sort of just calm myself being here. Also, I've spoken at ICAAD and quite a few times, and it feels a bit like a Glastonbury experience, because I'm usually downstairs in one of the small stages, and it's like I feel like I've made it to the pyramid. And then I realise it's the beginning of the day. This is not a headline act, but we're getting there. We're getting there. There you have it. So I've been working around addiction for actually 35 years, which is a bit shocking, but true. I worked in primary treatment, both in this country, but also the other side of the Atlantic for 15 years, and I've worked in private practice doing addiction psychotherapy and consultancy for the last sort of 20 years. And I'm a bit of an anorak. And I still really sort of enjoy, and I'm really stimulated by it all, because I think it's a really exciting time, actually, for the addictions field. When I started training in the 1980s, counsellors wore sort of tweed jackets. We looked a bit like sort of private school sort of teachers or something, and we treated alcohol and drug addictions. And now, of course, we've got all the process addictions. We start thinking about trauma. And we've also got, what really fascinates me is these sort of longitudinal studies of people in recovery and starting to think about sort of who does well, who doesn't do so well, and why. I have quite a bit. This is a topic that's actually quite close to my heart. I did the first talk on this actually at a precursor of ICAAD in 2008. I looked when I saw my notes, and I think it was the first time that had been a talk on addiction and adoption and putting those sort of two things together. And I do a talk like this. I mean, perhaps not even once a year. But it just really fascinates me. I have a lot to say on the topic, so actually I probably will really fill the hour, and there'll be lots of things that won't be said. So it may mean there's no room for questions. From my point of view, there's probably no room for complaints either. But I will be lurking around. I will be lurking around if you want to sort of tackle me on something. But adoptees are overrepresented in addiction treatment programs and in recovery programs. We didn't know that at first. When I trained in the 80s, I trained, it was the second treatment centre that had opened up in the UK, Cloud's House, it's still going. And the unit manager that I did a placement on had been adopted. I don't know quite how I picked that up. There were 4 trainees, including myself, and one of them was adopted. Interesting. The next year, there was another group of trainees, one of them was adopted. And actually, as some of you know, a lot of people who work in the addictions field are sort of in recovery. They sort of have some issues. In fact, because if you had more sense, you'd open a flower shop or something. And so actually what starts to happen, this is quite interesting. But I think I just sort of clocked it. What I do wonder, though, is when we did case conferences and things all those years ago, I wonder how many people we missed that were adopted, that may not have said. Because I certainly know from private practice that somebody comes in, usually in private addiction psychotherapy in private practice, people come in with process addictions. And you sort of ask them, the first question is sort of, why are we here and why now? And you might get them to tell you a little bit about their story. What was starting to happen, certainly sort of 10 or 15 years ago, is at the end of somebody telling you their childhood story, they might then say, by the way, I was adopted. So I do wonder, how much we missed. I'm also very interested in, I'm interested in what happens to people during the course of a recovery, and I become quite interested in what we're calling the disguised traumas, of which there are 2 that fascinate me. One is early boarders. People who went to boarding school at age 7 or 8 are overrepresented in treatment programs and recovery programs. Now, there might be a good reason for that, because actually they may well come from a background where they could actually afford to pay. Families might be able to pay. And we certainly need to do some more research. But I think it's quite interesting, because, of course, the early boarding wound is disguised as privilege. But actually, in calling it privilege, it covers up both a relinquishment, if you like, an abandonment, a captivity, because schools actually decide when you're there, when you go, and, of course, the enormous potential for abuse, although you don't have to go to boarding school to get abused, but you certainly are in captivity while it's happening. So I'm quite interested in all of that, the disguised traumas. And, of course, if you think about early boarders, actually, if a child is put into care, it's a tragedy. If you're sent to boarding school, it's a privilege. I think that's quite interesting. And then, of course, adoptees. And I think adoption and adoptees are also, this is a disguised trauma, because what I'm going to suggest to you is that the trauma isn't being adopted, the trauma is relinquishment. And that's the point that I want to make. But the cover-up, if you like, is that these children are chosen and perhaps saved. So a bit like the early boarders who are privileged. There isn't a PowerPoint. I do hold my notes in my hand because I'm going to talk about the brain a bit later on, but there's a part in my left frontal lobe, in my cortex, is a part of the brain named after the guy that found it, called Broca's area. And under extreme stress, Broca's area starts lighting up. Broca's area is associated with actually people who have stroke victims. It actually is part of sort of being verbal and processing words. And for me, it's part of what we would call, brain reduced to size of pea syndrome, as I stand here. But there's no PowerPoint. It's going to be more of a standout routine, I think, if that's okay with you guys. Or maybe not a standout routine. And I'm going to share some clinical experience. I want to stimulate thought and heighten awareness. I have, my clinical work is with people who were adopted, 20 plus years ago. So certainly talking to people who were adopted sort of nowadays 50, up to 50 years ago. Adoption is slightly different now, but the point that I'm going to make is there is no adoption without trauma. And I'm certainly not going to be talking politically about whether it should happen or anything like that. There isn't really time, and I'm not completely sure, to be honest. But what I do believe is that there is no adoption without trauma. And some people, we've had people come in who adopted 50 years ago who actually didn't know they were adopted through their childhood. And I can think of one case of somebody who was getting married and didn't have a birth certificate and went to Somerset House to get their birth certificate to discover that if you were adopted, back then you had a different you were a different class of citizen, you had a different birth certificate. And so at that point, discovers that she's adopted. Well, I wonder whose needs were being met. There's a Chinese proverb. It says, the beginning of wisdom is to call something by its proper name. I think this is really important around adoption because I think the word adoption, it has meaning, it's good, but I don't think it really talks about what goes on. The real wound is not adoption, it's relinquishment. And in a sense, adoption is a denial. It's a sort of happy ever after hope that, in which children are fortunate and in which they're chosen. Now, if you think about other conditions, if you suffered from bipolar, you wouldn't call them stabilizers, would you? If you suffered from drug addiction, we definitely wouldn't call them cleaners. So there's something about being relinquished and calling it adoption, which describes something but misses something. And I think it's a really important point. Because it's part of the feeling that a lot of adopted clients have as children that somehow what happened before didn't really matter. The old lie. You can't remember you were a baby. So what I'm going to propose to you, it's funny because when I chose a title for this talk, what I really wanted to call it was developmental trauma disorder. But as you probably know, that doesn't actually exist, allegedly, didn't make it into the DSM-5, despite people like Van der Kolk trying really hard to get it there. I'm not quite sure why it didn't. I certainly talk about it. Because I think that's what we're talking about. I think we're talking about a group of people who suffer from a complicated developmental trauma, which can be clinically seen as a post-traumatic stress disorder. And I will talk a bit about that. When it comes to adoption, this is the adoption 101 bit. We talk about an adoption triad. There is the adopted child, the relinquished child, there is the birth parent, and the adoptive parents. I don't see that many birth parents clinically, but I'm really always struck that the ones that do come to clinic, they tend to say things like, not a day goes by when I don't think about that child. I'd like to see more. I think it'd be interesting to study more. I think it's a really complicated area. I see quite a lot of adopted parents, usually of sort of adolescents, increasingly of transracial or transcultural, but really it's transracial adoptees tearing their hair out, saying things like, we've provided this lovely middle-class home, and we even sent them to boarding school. And just wondering sort of what on earth has happened. But this presentation is going to focus on the relinquished child and clinical considerations for the treatment of addictions and other mental health disorders, and particularly trauma. There isn't enough time to talk really about the others in the triad. There isn't really enough time to talk about the politics. I don't have a strong view about adoption or whether it could happen, but I think there's some interesting politics. I don't have time to talk about the adoption industry, and believe me, there is one. A lot of money changes hands. And we're hearing more and more about the abuses of the Catholic Church and the mother and baby units, which some of you may have, may hear about, where actually young mothers having children out of wedlock have sinned and need to be saved, where the baby is born and taken away straight away and looked after by people who have no experience actually of mothering. In fact, have forgone the opportunity of having children, meaning nuns. So adoption is a complicated grief for all. It's the grief of a child growing up, waiting to meet someone that they've spent 9 months waiting to meet. It's the adoption of the child growing up and then ending up being adopted into a family that doesn't genetically fit. It's also, it's the grief of a child who actually in many cases has an impossible job description, which is to be part of that family. It doesn't fit. I'm also not going to have time to talk about reunions, and I think they're really interesting. But one of the things you hear, there are two things that really strike me about reunion stories. One is there's a very high instance of sexual relations between a child and a biological parent, which really fascinates me. But the other thing that you hear is that I just sort of knew, I looked at them and we felt we sort of stood in the same way. There was a sense of, gosh, I genetically fit. It's always very complicated, all of this sort of stuff. But it's quite interesting, that sort of genetic fit that is clearly picked up at a very sort of unconscious level. This is about the grief of a parent who can't live with having a child, very often young mothers, very often poverty, very often a family or a patriarchal family system that has decided that actually this really isn't okay for us to have a child, at this age. What will people think? And I hear a lot of stories, as perhaps you do, of families that have relocated in the last 3 months of pregnancy, to other sort of continents in order to have a child that can then be adopted, given up for adoption. And I'm not sure how much say the young mothers really have in all of that. It's also about the grief of adoptive parents. There are some altruistic cases, but it is about the grief of adoptive parents. I mean, many people, when you get married, you sort of think that there's a good chance we could have children and we might have, we'll have a family and it'll all be all right. And there's all sorts of issues, of course, about sort of infertility, or sometimes the death of a child. We've had cases where people have been adopted into families where a child has died, and actually within a year another child has been taken on. I think that that's a bit of an impossible job description. I think it's a bit of an impossible job description to be a replacement child. Families who can't conceive, who've maybe had a child or can't conceive, adopt a child, and then do conceive. I think that brings up quite a few feelings. How wanted was I? How part of this? And the grief that goes with all of that for parents, who, if we're focusing on chosen and fortunate, actually that grief, what happens to that grief? Because you think as a couple, if he or she is infertile, there's also a whole lot of feelings there, aren't there? I thought we could do this. What does it mean? Do we still have a deal? Do you know? I feel a bit disappointed. I thought we could have our own child. The feelings of guilt and shame, of anger or resentment, all understandable, but all that need to be worked on and need to be talked about. But I think it doesn't get talked about. It's part of the cover-up. It's part of the problem, I think, in focusing too much on this word adoption and happy children chosen and fortunate. So it's about an enormous grief. The transcultural or transracial adoptions are fascinating. Of course, invariably, they are from black to white. They're sort of one way. And I think there's all sorts of problems with the politics of difference and all sorts of problems with sort of things like that, with racism. But my hypothesis is that the relinquishment is an abandonment. It's an abandonment trauma that's experienced as life-threatening at the beginning of life. It's hard to imagine a bigger trauma than actually loss of mother at the beginning of the life. Actually, Anna Freud, daughter of Sigmund, said Actually, the horrors of war pale in significance to the loss of mother. That's her quote. Pale in significance to the loss of mother. It's a pre-verbal, and which is going to be an important point I hope to make, psychological wound that is remembered but not recalled. And I think this is, and I'm going to talk a little bit about memory, because this is really important. It's very easy to think babies don't remember. You don't remember what's happened, but actually that makes it very, very complicated. Actually, we do have memory. What babies don't have is recall, because memory is implicit. It's in limbic brain, as opposed to actually in frontal cortex. It's still waiting to come online. So here's the neuroscience. Trauma and PTSD have been around for a long time. The large bulk of it has come up with it studying the Vietnam veterans. As you probably know, there was a lot of money for them, these guys coming back from war, the first time people had returned and weren't heroes. Big mental health problems. But actually, it's been around. Pierre Janet, who was at the end of the 19th century, talked about trauma as being the disease of presentation, which is quite, I was going to attempt to say that in French, but anyway, I'm not really good at that. But it's a disease of presentation, which is a really important point, because if you have trauma, you tend to have hypervigilance. And if you're in hypervigilance, it's very hard to be present. The two are mutually exclusive. And if you can't be present, you can't be spontaneous. So, I mean, I think that's quite interesting. We had a bit of, study of trauma, World War I, shell shock, and all of that. But it was mostly the sort of veterans. And then we start to think about what we call a trauma continuum, which is single event trauma on one end of the scale. You've been involved in some terrible accident or tragedy or an assault, to actually what we call sort of complex trauma, which is actually over a period of time, childhood sexual abuse, but I think also having been relinquished and trying to find your place in the world. What we also know about trauma is that actually what makes the difference between something being very stressful and something being very traumatic is attachment. Children actually are enormously resilient. But if you don't, so actually a stressful situation plus attachment remains a very stressful situation. A stressful situation without attachment tends to be a trauma. And I think it's really quite an important point. It's the storm analogy, isn't it? That you know that in the storm, the trees that blow down, they blow down not because of just the strength of the wind, but actually the ones that blow down are the ones where the roots aren't strong enough. There isn't actually, of course, if we talked in attachment theory, there isn't a secure base, literally. So stress minus attachment tends to be trauma. We know it a lot from studying the children in the Palestinian refugee camps when their houses were being bulldozed, and everybody thought, gosh, this is a bit heavy. You don't know if your house is going to be bulldozed. You might be in it. You might not. You might come back, it's not there. And the psychologists all moved in, and when they do the bank of psychometrics, they discover that actually children aren't that traumatized, and they're not, because there's people around. There are parents and tribe and family saying, this shouldn't be happening. This is outrageous. We're in it together. So think, if you're given up at the beginning of life by the one person that you really need, where is the secure base? What happens? Now, the human brain, unlike the computer, starts working before it's built. Okay? We have 100 billion neurons at birth. They can make 10,000 connections each. That's trillions of connections. And it actually, sort of neural development is dependent on social interaction. So as Van der Kolk said, and I love this phrase, and if it wasn't so well known, I'd try and pretend it was mine, experience is the architect of the brain. Alan Shaw, the American neuroscientist, says, neurons that fire together wire together. Experience is the architect of the brain. Neural development, depends on social interaction and experience. It's a really important point, and I'll come back to it later. We then had people like MacLean in the 1960s who introduced the idea of the triune brain, the idea that, wait a minute, we have not got just one brain, we have three. In fact, in each of those three areas, we have several other brains. But very typically, we have a rational brain, a cortex, we have a limbic brain, the emotional brain, and we have a reptilian brain. The cortex is responsible for level thinking, judgment, planning, conceptualizing. The limbic brain is involved with emotion and memory, and it's the limbic brain that's online from the beginning. It's the limbic, and the cortex, because it isn't online at the beginning, is why we don't have recall, why we only start to remember things about our lives from about the age of sort of 3 or 4, depending. But there is memory, and I'll come back to that. And it's the limbic brain that's involved in mother-infant bonding. It was my limbic brain that soothed me when I was looking at my colleagues on the screen earlier on. It's my limbic brain that soothes me when I look around and I see a few people here that I know, and I think, yes, it's probably not an intervention. I think they're here to listen to me. Very, very important. So it's really part of mother-infant bonding. I'm going to look at the time, because you may also know that under stress, the part of the brain that mediates time switches off. So it's very possible for me to think I've only just started talking, and in fact, I've been talking for several hours. And when I'm under stress and you're not, you're going to be looking at your watch because you know how much time has passed. And actually also because I really don't want to miss things. The other danger is that you get to the end of all of this and you miss the bit that says, so what are we going to do about it? It'll be like one of those self-help books. You get right to the end and everyone's explained your problems perfectly well. And actually, you don't know what you're going to do. So I'll be really trying to save you from that. Okay, and developmental trauma, there are 3 responses to trauma in general. One is, or a stressful situation. One is social engagement, a sort of like, let's get into the muddle, let's have a chat about this, I'm not happy about that. Tends to not be traumatic if you can do that. The other is mobilization, which is fight and flight that you hear about. Right, I'm going to run from here. And stress hormones, sometimes stress hormones get a bad name. Stress hormones are really good. They're really good. The problem is when you've got stress hormones, you can't do anything with them. If you've had a shot, if your adrenal glands are doing what they should do, because your limbic brain has sent a message to reptilian brain that we need to mobilize, if you can fight or flight, that's pretty cool. You get to use up your hormones. It's a bit of a problem if you have an early psychological wound, because babies can't flight and fight. So they tend to be left with fawn. Actually, Pierre Janet, I'm a bit of a fan because I think it's so cool that people were talking about this. Pierre Janet he influenced Freud and Jung and William James. He's a very interesting guy and probably a name some of you haven't even heard of, but Freud and Jung and William James. He also introduced the term, it was him who came up with dissociation. That's from him. And was starting to talk about things like transference, actually. He didn't use that word, but it comes from him. I don't quite know where I've gone with that, actually. I'm really sorry. Because I do get a bit excited. That is the other problem. Let's do attachment theory. Anyway, you can't really avoid learning about attachment theory, can you really, if you study psychotherapy and counselling. And it's one of those things, it's actually rather obvious now, and it's shocking to think that in the 1950s, actually we didn't really get our head around it. And those of you that have studied attachment theory may have seen, and they're on YouTube, the black and white pictures of children being left in hospitals, infants left in hospitals. They're really distressing. I wouldn't do it unless you really have to. Seeing these little children who've been left and that are crying. But it did have an enormous impact, actually, on parents staying with children in hospitals. Although, I hope there's no one who's trained at the TAVI here, but if you go to the TAVI, on the steps, in the staircase in the TAVI, these black and white pictures of the great names, Bowlby, Bion, marvellous people, actually, Winnicott, but many of those people, very concerned about attachment theory, didn't stop them sending their kids to boarding school very early on. But they'll be tutting at the TAVI if they ever watch the recording. I quite like that expression, tutting at the TAVI. So where are we? Yeah, so Bowlby, and of course fascinating, isn't it, attachment theory. So Bowlby had to go to America to have it taken seriously, bring it back here. But actually, a lot of the work was done by the women, Mary Ainsworth, later, Mary Main, the American psychologist in the 90s, did awful lot of the work. But basically, the idea of attachment theory is there's a biological inbuilt sort of system that motivates infants to seek proximity to caregivers. And it's all about survival. It's so that you can be protected from harm, from starvation, from attack and separation. And it's why a lot of mammals will make a lot of noise when mother disappears. Puppies, kittens, ducklings, humans, they cry. You cry out. It's about seeking attachment. I'm here. You know, I live down in the country, you see all these lambs. I'm really struck by how a lamb can call and the right ewe comes along. Because it seems a bit of a lottery to me when you're in the field. But they can. They come along. And interesting, when you talk to adoptees, they tend to cluster at each end of the spectrum. So you'll meet some who will say, I was told I just cried and cried. I just cried and cried. And then you'll meet others, and it often gets me thinking about things like the Romanian orphans, who just said, actually, apparently I was just a really silent baby. They went into freeze and dissociation. They actually didn't make any noise. And a lot of the people we're seeing are clustering at either end. You're either crying an awful lot, or actually you've gone into complete silence. Mary Main was the person who really came up with the ideas about insecure attachment and all the different classifications, which you probably know, and was very clear that mother-infant bonding it has an enormous sort of influence on psychopathology later in life. In fact, she said that the well-being of the child is 75% dependent on the mental well-being of the mother. The mother's ability to, what she said, the mother's ability to tell an emotionally coherent story. That means a story of her life, not a story. And we sort of know this. We know human beings need to be sort of known and understood to belong to a group. That's how we stay safe. That's how we're top of the food chain. We weren't always, but we've done it because we're group animals. And attachment theory helps us sort of stay together and regulates us at times like this, for example. There's also, though, you get what Freud talked about. Freud talked about His Majesty the baby, and there's the notion too, I think, of bad baby syndrome. The idea that the child. So what Freud was really saying was that the human infant is enormously self-centered, and if something is wrong in the world, the human infant is unable to think there's something up with mum and dad. They tend to think that it must be about me. You see it with early cases of sexual abuse, actually. The amount of people, and you'll know this, you can see in the consulting room, who have been clearly sexually abused, who feel in some way they are responsible for the abuse. Again, it tends to cluster with gender. The females tend to think somehow I brought it on. The males tend to feel ashamed because somehow they didn't fight it off. But somewhere that feeling of this is something to do with me. So again, where attachment starts to go wrong, a feeling that, the infant is unable to think, Dad hit Mum. I think that's not right. Dad went off. Mum did this. There's something wrong with me, which of course is the beginning of shame. It's the beginning of anxiety, these great feelings that fuel addictions. So the child basically grows up like a plant around a stone, just sort of adapting. And in many ways, adoption is an adaptation. And I think that feels like an important point. I'm going to talk about memory for a moment. I hope to bring all of this sort of stuff together. But Tony DeCasper at the University of North Carolina, great guy, lots of prenatal research. And this is really, really important stuff, because what he was able to show is that the newborn infant, within 24 hours of being born, can detect mother's breast milk on a pad of 10 different breast milks. Okay? That's memory. That's memory. Now, people often say, how do you know? Because they're certainly not filling out questionnaires saying, I like that one best. But we know it because actually they're measured by head turning, sucking and respiration responses. Basically a dummy with a pressure monitor on the end. Now he also it showed us that in the last 6 weeks of pregnancy, babies actually remember sounds of voices and actually sort of, I don't know whether it's quite tones, I think it's probably cadence. So what he had people doing was that pregnant mothers in the last 6 months of pregnancy reading The Cat in the Hat out loud to the baby. And these babies showed a preference for mother's voice over other voices, sucking, head turning, respiration responses. Okay? They also showed a preference for the cat in the hat. I think that's interesting. So that old lie that you can't remember, it doesn't affect you, is really challenged because this stuff is stored limbically. Now, actually, Tony de Casper died. He died a couple of years ago. I bet none of you have even heard of him, have you? No. I rather hope at his funeral they read The Cat in the Hat. Maybe he might hear it. Maybe it'll soothe him in the afterlife. Who knows? But really, very, very important experiments. About prenatal experience, and we have to hold on to this because what it is telling us. So, if you think about being prepared to listen to mum's voice or to hear some of the sounds and that changing, actually your world feels pretty unsafe when that suddenly goes. And what I'm also going to suggest to you is that whilst we might talk about one adoption, we are actually often talking about many relinquishments because it's quite rare that baby is born and handed over. It's much more likely, and that's before we start talking about incubators and premature babies. And we know that there's lots of research actually on incubated babies, on preemie babies, and very high incidence of depression. Perhaps not too surprisingly, but there's a lot of research on that. But so you're born, you're given up by mother. You might be taken off, maybe by the nuns. You might be taken off somewhere, left. I've lived a lot of people who were sort of left outside of orphanages. In India or South America, Nepal, a lot of these stories. You're taken in, you're one of many. Somebody tries to find a home for you. So you think you've got relinquishment from mum, everything changes. God, bloody hell, what's happening if the child could talk? There I am. Okay, we're getting used to this. It's slightly different smells and sounds and stuff, but these people, maybe this is sort of all right. Not getting an awful lot of holding. There's rather a lot of us babies here, I should think. It's that sort of thing. And then you're off again. If you're a transracial adoptee, that's quite a problem too. Because actually, it's the things that really, so think about smell and what Tony de Casper told us about smell. The Indian subcontinent smells different from, downtown Kensington. It just does. These things are different. The sounds are different. The cadence is different. It smells different. These are big disruptions. And this is also before we start talking about, we've had clients who actually have been adopted and then given back. You sort of think like, I don't know, it's like doing a return to Amazon or something, isn't it? It doesn't work. But you think what that does. And there are lots of different adoptions that happen. So people that are maybe somebody's born into a family where, or maybe adopted into a family where there's already a child, or maybe later on discovers actually on reunion that they were given up by a family that kept all the other children. There's so many different, it's a very, very colourful thing. And the story, the relinquishment stories are really, really important because those are the stories that affect limbic brain. Those are the things that are remembered limbically, are held in implicit memory systems, and actually start to make sense of things that happen later in life. So good old Tony de Casper and the cat in the hat, I think. So what do we see in adoptees and indeed, I think actually the important thing is that other people who suffer from early developmental wounds. We see issues with concentration and focus, the hypervigilance, living on red alert, very hard to be present. We see difficulties in relationships and difficulties being oneself. Because the first time I was myself, it was pretty disruptive. Actually it was a disaster. That's the feeling. Limbically, being myself is probably not a good thing. We see a loss of self. We see an awful lot of codependence, people trying to be something else for others in order to fit in. What do you have to do to to fit in round here, which is sort of what codependence in many ways is about. We see sleep dysregulation. We see a lot of gastrointestinal problems. Probably not a surprise, because the world of the baby is pretty much poo and puke, isn't it? You know, so a lot of gastrointestinal problems, a lot of skin rashes. I don't know how well that's been researched. Quite a lot of high incidence of things like psoriasis. Certainly see a lot of shallow breathing. And in fact, part of trying to help people with these sort of traumas often involves breathing. That's actually why the horses are very good. Because if you can calm yourself around a horse, you can connect to the horse, because they read the body language. People with early developmental trauma breathe in a really shallow way. And the problem with that is you miss out on the out-breath. So the in-breath is about the sympathetic nervous system. The in-breath is right, we're ready for something. And that's if you had developmental trauma, that's sort of where you always are. The out-breath calms the parasympathetic nervous system. Breathing deeply and breathing out slowly is really important. That's why, although I'm sure they didn't know it at the time, saying om for a long note is very calming. It's why actually whistling might sort of really piss off lots of people around you, but actually is quite calming. It's why in church a lot of hymns begin with these very long notes. I'm not going to try and do it, but you know, oh God, you know, the sort of thing, I mean, because that's calming. It's very calming, but of course you don't have that because shallow breathing and often held breath. In fact, around the horses, one of the things you often have to do with people is to say, breathe, and they breathe, and the horse completely changes. Because if you're like that, you know, horses are preyed upon, so they're forever, like they want to know who's going to have them for dinner. That's what, you know, that's why they're, you know, such experts. We see a lot of self-soothing. We see early compulsive masturbation, a lot of nail biting and thumb sucking with early developmental trauma, overuse of sugar, quite a few OCD behaviours, hair pulling, things like that. The other thing that's quite interesting is certainly in private practice when you're working with adoptees, you might give them a bank of psychometric questionnaires. You might measure depression and anxiety. What you do find is that people who've had depression and anxiety for a long time often don't look as depressed or anxious as they are. So if you think about a standard depression question like the BDI, Beck's Depression Inventory, if you score over 23, you probably want to have a chat with your GP about some antidepressants. Not saying you should take them, but it's the sort of thing that somebody would consider. We're talking about groups of people that might be scoring up in the high 20s, but when you look at them, they're quite put together because basically they've just learned to live with. They've normalized these sort of things. They look really quite put together. People with an incidental depression, you can see depression, can't you? I mean, it's a shape. But, you know, this has gone on for a long time. It's a very different presentation. It's really worth doing because it's quite easy to think these people are all right. And I get quite a few people, actually, in clinic who feel the need to say to me, Paul, you do know how fucked up I am, don't you? Do you know? Because I also like to be quite sort of positive about what people are doing. But this is terrible because people realise they have become experts in sort of hiding how they are. We see a lot of catastrophic thinking. And of course, I mean, why wouldn't you? If you've had a catastrophe, you know, if the first person in your life leaves you, who says the next person isn't going to do it? So you get an awful lot of catastrophic thinking. And people are they get an envelope and they don't recognise the writing and it's like, this is something awful. Do you know? An awful lot of, you know, real sensitivity to sort of criticism and things like that. We also start to see, we see a lot of addiction to adrenaline, and I think that's a really interesting point, because I think that actually sometimes I wonder whether addiction actually really is an attempt to regulate by restoring sort of cortisol and adrenaline. We see there's mother-infant bonding is associated with low serotonin as well, by the way, and serotonin actually has an enormous impact on the bit of the brain that you probably all have heard about, which is the amygdala, the smoke detector in the limbic brain, the one that sort of goes off and tells you that there's danger. That if you have low serotonin as a result of failed mother-infant bonding, your smoke detector is going to go off, it's going to go off when the toast is in rather than when the house is on fire, yeah, basically. A lot of addiction to adrenaline, people with, you know, dangerous occupations, working in war zones, in different ways, in quite famous cases around that. A lot of dangerous sports, skiing off-piste, swimming with sharks. And of course, we see the chemical and process addictions, religiosity, meaning fundamentalism. I think it's probably our number one mental health disorder. Workaholism, the addiction to busyness and adrenaline, of course. Eating disorders, either control by restricting of my world is so out of control, but I can restrict, or the soothing that happens from overeating. And the soothing is, and of course, what happens if we're eating and chewing? What the limbic brain picks up when we're eating and chewing is that things must be okay. We can't be under attack because we're having a meal. And that sends a message to the reptilian brain that says, it's all right, you can put your weapons down, guys. We can just hang out. So actually, seriously, when we talk about comfort eating, that is actually what we're doing. And it's one of the things that we have to really train people with those sort of eating disorders to think about. It makes a sense what you're doing. But actually you're trying to regulate something that could possibly be regulated in another way. So we're also seeing people with an awful lot of ambivalence, a feeling that ambivalence is what is being pulled strongly in two directions. So we're seeing groups of people who, in terms of frontal cortex, really want to do something. They've got a vision and a goal. And actually, a lot of adoptees are very, very bright because cortisol is a growth hormone. So if you get a big shot of it at the beginning, you're going to get a bigger brain, you're going to get more opportunities. So it's associated with high intelligence. So you've got people who really got a lot of capabilities, but you've got a limbic brain that says, I'm not really that valuable, and the world is pretty dangerous anyway, and who knows what's around the corner. So you get pulled in two directions, which means that you do what we see a lot of our clients say they do, sabotage. But it's because we've got two parts of the brain pulling strongly in two directions. Ambivalence. It's Latin. Ambivalence. So all of this, of course, is like the sort of beginnings. A lot of this stuff becomes the beginnings of codependency. There are four... Okay. I really do need to make sure we talk about what we can do, don't I? Because we're going to be in a real state. There are four problems for the relinquished child. Very, very important. I want you to get this. Some of you are taking notes. It's being recorded anyway. But the first one is there is a trauma. I hope that I pointed that out to you. There is a trauma. Actually, there's memory. We know what's safe. We know what isn't. And actually it goes. And there are several traumas in the whole relinquishment. There might be a happy adoption in terms of a nice family, but there is a trauma, and if it's not talked about, that's a real problem. It's a real problem, and that's where you start getting into, it's like the whole adult child movement that's going on today, which is brilliant, really, which is really a trauma therapy. Because, if stuff isn't talked about, then it doesn't get processed. You can only change what you acknowledge. And for the child, you can only acknowledge what is acknowledged for you. So there is a trauma, number one, okay? Anna Freud says, horrors of war pale in comparison. Number two, the trauma can't be recalled, but it's remembered, which means that actually people with these early wounds have real difficulty making sense of themselves. If you have a car crash, if you're assaulted, you sort of can remember what happened. It makes a bit of a sense. Third point, really important, is that an early developmental wound, there is no what we call pre-trauma personality. So if you have a car crash or you're assaulted round the corner here, and you might think, oh, bloody hell, I'm not going near Ken High Street again, you do at least know that once upon a time you could go near Ken High Street. If you have a trauma at the beginning of your life, what you don't have is an experience of being okay at any point. So you have the feeling that this is me. Everything I feel about myself is me. Everything I feel about myself is me and that person that isn't good enough and yet is also too much. Very, very difficult. You then have the fourth problem that these people have, which is adaptation requires fitting in with another tribe. And often a tribe that hasn't really talked about why you're there and what it means and what their grief was. The impossible job description. So let's come to treatment and recovery. The goal, of course, of treatment is to decrease the disorganizing impact of arousal. It's about affect regulation. It's about trying to do something about dysregulation that happens so easily for people who've had trauma. Dysregulation being the message that goes in a nanosecond from limbic brain to reptilian brain that says we're under attack, which bypasses a nanosecond before the frontal cortex has a chance to really think about it. That's why actually there isn't a lot of evidence with trauma victims that doing things like making gratitude lists make any difference, because actually the part of the brain that actually starts to regulate us isn't really interested in what's on the gratitude list. You know, you're going to be hijacked whatever happens. Well, we know when we're treating addictions, we know, don't we, that there are four scales in a way. If people have a drug or alcohol addiction, the chemical addictions have to be treated first. You then want to think about the process addictions. You then want to think about the codependency below all of that. You then want to think about the trauma. So, you know, there are certain things, sometimes a bit of an order, but it's quite difficult to, you know, treat this stuff in somebody who's out of control with their drug and alcohol use. And actually, to some extent, eating disorders, because food is, of course, such a sort of chemical. And certainly as clinicians, we need to be, I think, what Alice Miller called an enlightened witness. I think we have a responsibility, and this is why I like to do this stuff, to say, hey guys, this is the thing. You know, you belong to a group that's overrepresented in addiction. You know, we think there's a reason for that. We may not understand it properly, but we think there's a reason. You sort of need to know. You know, that you have clusters of symptoms. An enlightened witness to be able to sort of understand what's happening. We need to be a teacher in order to make things clear. The real C word, I think, in addictions counselling is clarity. Giving people real clarity about what we're doing, why we're doing it, what's going to happen. We need to be a therapist. We need to understand transference and countertransference. There's an awful lot of longing for the therapist. There's also quite a bit of hating the therapist. But all is worth trying to understand. We need to be an interpreter. I can think of a client we've had who said to me, she was given up at 2 weeks, and you try and hold the story in mind when they listen to the things that they bring along. And I'm really trying to do something about my eating, and I start this new regime of eating, but I seem to give up around sort of 12 days. I think that's quite interesting, don't you? That somebody might give up on themselves, you know, at a point in which they were given up. I don't know, maybe I've been hanging around with the analysts for too long, but it's like those sort of things I think are really fascinating. We need to be a coach. There's a lot of goal and vision setting. But the thing is that talking and self-knowledge often isn't enough. And hold that in mind. It's because it's very frontal cortex. And also remember Broca's area, that when you start talking about trauma, this is what the guys at Harvard Med School discovered, put the people in an MRI scan, start them thinking about their trauma, and Broca's area sort of actually doesn't light up, it actually goes offline, which is why then they can't remember things. It's why a lot of people with early wounds like to record sessions or make notes. I used to be terribly worried about that in case it ended up in court or something, because I'm quite capable of saying something ridiculous. And but actually it just makes a lot of sense, because they come out and somebody says, how was your session? And I don't remember. It's being processed somewhere, but it's not recalled. I don't recall should be what they say. So there are different things. We need to do either top-down therapies or bottom-up therapies. Top-down means thinking about cortex and working down to reptilian. And bottom-up means maybe thinking more about the sort of the body and things that are happening more sort of in a reptilian way. I think there's one journey. I think there are many roads. I think if you come across someone who tells you there's only one way to do it, that's probably not the person to be referred to. The person to be referred to is probably the one who says, I'm not quite sure, but we're trying lots of different things, because actually there's so much we don't know. Like many mental health issues, very good at describing, not so great at treating. And I think as psychotherapists, we can get a bit sort of precious and a bit worried, I think. You know, there's over 50 different schools of psychotherapy in the UK. I'm sure everyone's terribly worried that the other 49 are a bit better. So we can get quite protective and sort of not share the information. But the top-down approach is based on the idea that you can only change what you acknowledge. It's a really important thing. You can only change what you acknowledge, the Chinese proverb, okay? the beginning of wisdom, called something by its proper name. And the idea that actually victims don't recover. Unless you acknowledge something, you're going to stay a victim. I think it's one of the reasons why 12-step programs can be quite effective, because there's a big emphasis on admission and acknowledgement. Aside from the fact that they are also anxiety and stress management programs, they seem to be, like, people like to call them spiritual, but really it's about limbic resonance and anxiety and stress management. It's about hanging out with people who sort of get you. It's about attachment. There's an awful lot more to it. But really it's just helping people understand also that recovery is measured by the uncomfortable actions that you take. That you do have to get some coaching. You're going to have to, if you want to change, you're going to have to try and push yourself out of a comfort zone. You're going to need help for that. Again, why self-help groups, coaches, buddies are really important. Recovery is measured by the uncomfortable actions that you take. And people need information that actually, avoidance is pretty exhausting. For example, it actually takes more energy to not do something than it does to do it. I had this yesterday morning. I took the morning off to write my presentation. I got exhausted and I did nothing at all because I was just desperately trying to do everything else. As soon as I got going, I was in it. It takes more energy to put something off than it does to do it. The other important point is to help people realize that getting well, the problem with getting well is that you get to discover how unwell you've been, and there is a bit of depression with that. So actually sometimes, and of course also the absence of drama can feel like there's something wrong. If you've been adrenalized, if you had adrenaline and cortisol for a long time, the absence of drama does feel a bit flat. And if we're onto something with the idea that addiction actually might be something to do with an addiction to adrenaline and cortisol, because we need to somehow do things consistently that leave us feeling ashamed and anxious, then when you stop doing that, here, frontal cortex says, that's a good idea. Here, limbic brain says, feels a bit fucking weird. Sorry about my clinical language, but we'll sort of get there. So a lot of information. People also need info about relationships. The whole idea that, because the problem is if you can't be yourself, it's very hard to have a relationship. Esther Perel says, is this lovely phrase, isn't it? In order to be one, you need to be two. In order to be one as a couple, you need to be two. But actually, we're talking about people for whom actually abandonment, the amygdala goes off very, very early on. So when she says, I don't think I want to go out tonight, I'm just going to stay at home, he goes, she doesn't love me anymore, she's got someone else, I'm going to be left. And vice versa. Because the amygdala has reacted to the toaster, not the house burning down. So people need a lot of understanding, and the other one, understanding in relationships. Actually, we tend to partner up with people who are pretty much the same, as intimate and capable as we are. So if you're in a relationship with someone who makes out they're a bit more have done more personal growth and more developed, I'd walk in the other direction. Because Snow White never marries the big bad wolf. It doesn't happen like that. And Prince Charming doesn't marry the Wicked Witch. It just doesn't happen like that. We then have the bottom up. I'm talking so quickly, and I'm sorry because I don't want to miss it. And I'm excited. I think this is really, are you with me? I think this is such important stuff, don't you? The bottom up therapies are the one that are going to be far more thinking about reptilian brain. So we're talking about well-being habits, exercise, nutrition, relaxation, prayer, meditation rituals, body awareness. Actually going to the gym, toning, Pilates, really, really important. If you're doing Pilates, it's quite hard to feel depressed and anxious if you can stand up straight. The more awareness you have of your body, I'm not talking, but you don't have to pump iron forever or, enter competitions. But having a body awareness is really, really important. Because actually, a lot of the time, we're talking about people who somehow are safest under the radar. And under the radar is a shape, and that shape is a feeling. Some of the somatic therapies, so somatic experiencing, very much sort of in flavour, basically focuses on clients' body sensations, helping them learn to sort of navigate them when they're triggered. Very, very good alongside other therapies. Anything sort of somatic I think is important. EMDR, another big flavour, eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing. I have to tell you, there's not a lot of clinical research. In fact, there isn't really any clinical research into developmental trauma, early wounds with EMDR. It is a treatment of choice. It's very effective. for single incident trauma and adult trauma. But I think it's always worth doing. I think it doesn't do any harm. Worst scenario is it calms the hypothalamus, actually. So you can feel quite sort of calm afterwards. But EMDR focuses, as you know, on what they call negative cognitions. What actually, years before, psychologists like Bolas called unthought knowns. Things in our brain that we know, but we don't know we know. They're unthought knowns. I'm not worthy. The world isn't a safe place. I can't possibly be myself. Visible is vulnerable. All the things that they're not in our conscious, but they're there in limbic brain. And they drive. They're the ones that send the signal nanoseconds before the frontal cortex that actually there's danger. It's those cognitions that dysregulate us. It's the same thing. I often say this one. It's like when the man-eating tiger enters the room, it's the limbic brain that says, let's get out of here, before the frontal cortex can say, what nice stripes. You know, there's a reason. It's about survival. And it actually, of course, in many ways defies logic and becomes very much about, it means it's very hard to take the long view. So if that's how you're geared up with your amygdala, you have low serotonin associated with your amygdala going off early, then actually it becomes quite hard to see things through, that if I do this, then that will happen down the line. Which is why I think a lot of the 12-step programs have talked about insanity, you know, and all of that stuff about repeating mistakes and being unable to see things to their full conclusion. Because you're probably hijacked by an limbic brain that's just ready, you know, to take an action now, because it doesn't matter what happens later if you're in danger. I'm a big fan of the horses, as you know. They're experts in reading body language. They pick up on all the somatic signs, breathing, muscle tension, heart rate, and they're very good at teaching boundaries. If you've got half a ton of animal in front of you, you're going to learn how to keep a boundary with it. They don't play games, and they're very good at teaching self-soothing, because as you regulate yourself, it helps you learn to do this deep abdominal breathing, which is so absent with developmental trauma disorder. Psychodramas, very, very useful stuff. Emotional freedom technique, known as tapping. I've never actually done it, but I don't know why I have a problem with it, because there is actually quite a lot of good clinical sort of data. I just think it's a bit odd. But actually, that's just me. There's good clinical evidence for EFT. Havening, another one, quite a somatic sort of therapy you may know about. Mindfulness practices, of course, but mindfulness best done when it focuses on breathing. Because again, if we can organize our breath, and we've got the out breath, we can send a message from the bottom up. The out breath is saying to limbic brain, things are okay. We're not, you know, we're not on red alert anymore. We're not armed and ready for the, you know, for the instruction to go into battle. And limbic brain can think, okay, let's chill. And actually, the cortex can then think, yeah, let's get on with what we were doing. Let's get on with what we were doing that somehow we were sort of taken away from. So, I don't know if I've convinced you, but I think we're talking about a very powerful developmental trauma. You were talking about an abandonment that is experienced as life-threatening, so that and the brain, which is a reflective organ, when it comes across, and that's why we're top of the food chain, when it comes across something similar, like he doesn't want to be with me, she doesn't, my boss is giving me a funny look, smoke detector goes off, amygdala goes off, we think we're about to lose our jobs, lose our lives, be annihilated, it's going to be the end of the world. We have become dysregulated, hijacked. And the aim of treatment really needs to be sort of affect regulation. Does it make sense? Yeah? I never got time to do this, because I'm supposed to stop 5 minutes ago. I'm going very quickly, because actually one of my clients brought in, she's 60, and she brought a letter in that she'd found. Her parents had died, and she brought a letter in from that a Harley Street doctor had written about her when she was aged 8, and she was having some stomach problems, some gastrointestinal problems. Her father, father was an alcoholic. She may well at that time have been sent off to boarding school, but she was taken up to Harley Street. So this is 1968. It says, And this is back to from the specialist to the GP. So, dear Dr. So-and-so, thank you for your letter about client's name. It was delightful to hear from you again. Fair enough. Physically, client is 100% healthy and possesses one of the most lovely figures that I've seen in a young girl for a long time. She's really beautiful. Well, you wouldn't say that, would you, nowadays? Intellectually, client is at least 3 years in advance of her age, and I'm sure she finds it irksome and frustrating to conform to the behaviour pattern expected of her age. I'm glad to know that she's going off to boarding school in a year because the routine and discipline of boarding school will be much to her liking and will. Massive history of bedwetting, by the way. Big history of bedwetting with all of this. Not a very cool thing to do if you're at boarding school, as you might know. You know, difference is really attacked. Like so many very active, tireless children, she is inclined at times to be a bit liverish, and this aspect would be helped by cutting down on intake of fat and cream and seeing that at meal times she gets a good intake of sugar. Do you want to guess the process addiction? Yes, you're right, of course. Comfort eating, compulsive overeater. Yeah. I think I'll sort of leave the letter there. Anyway, we've moved on. We've moved on from all of that, and this is the thing, and people didn't know, but we do, and we have a responsibility to say, this is a thing. This is a thing. You know, if experience is the architect of the brain, you've been wired up differently. And God, that was my whistle-stop tour of adoption. There's so much more to say. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of ICAAD. My name is Araminta Johnson, and I am in charge of ICAAD's marketing and content. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce the one and only Benjamin Fry. Benjamin is a man of many hats. He is the founder of Neural Solution, Chiron House, Get Stable, and he has also written a book called The Invisible Lion. I had the greatest of pleasures of going and interviewing him a couple of months ago, and I learned all about the PhysioCam, which he is going to give a world really exclusive demonstration today. So it's really exciting, I have to say. What I found out was, thrilling, and I hope you guys really enjoy his talk. And also, as I mentioned, his book, The Invisible Lion, it's out now on Amazon, and he will be downstairs at 1:15 doing a book signing. So make sure you get down there and grab yourself a copy. Thank you very much, Benjamin. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. Well, as you know, this session is called Biohacking the Nervous System. What could that possibly mean? What could it possibly mean to any of you? I'm always curious about who's here and why. A quick show of hands, who works with clients here? I assume pretty much everyone. And who would say they work in addiction? Hands up. And who would say they work in mental health? So basically, most people work in everything, right? So who works with the nervous system? Yeah. Well, my somewhat biased point of view, which I'll declare straight up, is you all work with the nervous system. So if you don't yet work with the nervous system and you work with clients and you work in mental health or behavioral health, there's something in this hour for you and for your clients, I hope. Now, the other side of this is if we work with the nervous system is not a concept. It's an actual physical thing in your body. So it's kind of like bioengineering. And if you're working with a physical thing, why aren't we working with technology that can measure and intervene and help us work with a physical thing? So to answer the questions about how technology can be useful with the nervous system, I think first we have to look a little bit about why we would talk about working with the nervous system at all. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to do is make a link from working with clients, working with behavior, working with mental health, through into the nervous system, through into technology, and back again. Is there anyone who wants to leave now? There's the people sitting near the door. If you want to leave, just wave and I'll know I'm off track and I'll try and do something else. So that's where I'm going to begin. I'll do about 20 minutes just talking you through some slides up here. And we'll hopefully do 20 minutes of demonstrating the theory in a pseudo session with a volunteer while watching the session with the PhysioCam, which hopefully will reveal the neural regulation during the session. Very ambitious, and it'll probably go wrong, but never mind. So think about, if there's anyone, as you're watching me talk about this, think about if you are interested in being a volunteer for this session. And if so, I will call you up and we'll explore that. So one of the interesting little phrases that people told me about addiction care or recovery is that actually staying sober is easy. You just have to not drink between meetings. Anyone heard that one? And it's very true, of course. Of course it's true. But the question is, why is that true? What's the hidden intelligence in that statement? What is it about going to a meeting that returns you to somewhere that you've drifted from that means you have to go to a meeting? So that's kind of the point, isn't it? That there's something that happens at a meeting which gets you from a place where relapse might be more likely to a place where relapse is less likely. I'm sure many people in this room have many theories about that, but let's have a quick look at it from the point of view of the nervous system. Can you guys see if I stand here? Who am I in the way of? Everyone. Right, maybe I'll go over here, but then I'm sort of away from your, never mind. So this is kind of the world of health through diagrams about the nervous system. If you're curious about this, you can have a look more in depth in my book here, which you might notice. But I'm just going to take you through these diagrams here. These ones up here relate to the three areas of healthcare that we really know about are body, mind, and spirit. Okay? So this is really a diagram of your brain, which is disagreeing with itself because its prefrontal cortex, its mammal system, and its reptile system are out of sync. Now, this is pretty much the case for every dysregulated nervous system. Sometimes we call this trauma, sometimes we call it PTSD, sometimes we just call it life. But this is pretty much how humans have come into not being the same as our animal cousins. This is, I haven't got time to explain all of this, but take it from me that the blue is a dysregulated nervous system in your body. If you were a gazelle, this line would look like the dotted line there and everything would be fine. You respond to threat, evenly you come up, if you survive it comes down. If you don't do that, you end up like this. So, what that brings you into is a state of being, which is essentially what we'll call a dysregulated nervous system. And this is the piece of your nervous system which is not yet finished responding to an earlier threat. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but there's something about a threat that was earlier than now that was overwhelming enough to leave some unfinished business. And I don't mean kind of in terms of thoughts or memories, I mean really in terms of the physiology's response to threat. And we all know that physiology responds very strongly to threat. So it should go up, it should come down. If it's not all the way down, you're left with something. And we call this baggage. It's a very conventional idea that people are carrying around their baggage. Now, if you take that on board as the kind of state of being that we're in, what happens next? What happens to us as we wander around life? Shout out, feel free. Get triggered. You know, stuff happens, really. You know, life happens. So here is life happening to a dysregulated nervous system. What would you expect to happen next?
More dysregulation.
Well, it's interesting to see whether you would even complete your response to this new threat. And if not, then you're adding more dysregulation. But the answer is, of course, there's some kind of response to this, some kind of reaction. And it looks like this sometimes, which is an overreaction. Now, you'll notice that the red arrow is much bigger than the green arrow. So you might say the green arrow is maybe a 3 out of 10 trigger, and the red arrow is maybe a 9 out of 10 reaction. And what's that going to look like if you can't see the baggage? That looks like an overreaction, right? Now, is there a mental health classification for people who have overreactions? Is it called borderline personality disorder, for example, or many other things? But there's another thing that can happen when you feel like you're going to have an overreaction, and that feels very threatening because big reactions in the body can be distressing for people who don't feel that that's okay, is you can have this kind of reaction, which is an underreaction. So this is a reaction where you want to explode, but you wall it all in. Right? So you've got effectively two ways that a nervous system that's dysregulated can respond to a trigger in the here and now. One is to over-respond, and one is to under-respond. But you very rarely get it just right. If you do, this is your Goldilocks nervous system here. Right? So you'll notice here that there really isn't any baggage at all. So you get a 3 out of 10 problem, and you get a 3 out of 10 reaction. And what's it like to be around that person? Can you collaborate with that person? Can you solve problems with that person? Can you solve problems with other people when you are that person? Who would like to be this person every day in the consulting room with their clients? Yeah? So this is your ideal therapist nervous system. Who in this room doesn't have baggage? Thank God. So scary when people put their hand up to that question. Right, so you've got a problem here, and you've got a problem, every individual, every human has a problem, which is that in order to get along best in life, this wants to be your way of being. But we've got this third thing in the middle, which gets in the way. And you can only see it on the inside, you can't see it on the outside. From the outside, all you can see is there's nothing going on or there's too much going on. So the question is, what do we do about it? Right? You'll notice there's only 3 lines on this drawing. Right? There's a trigger, there's a baggage, there's a reaction. So there's only 3 things you can do to change this picture. And we'll take them in turn. That is a trigger which is being reduced. What do you think we would call the blue line? A boundary. Now, if you work in addiction treatment, you'll hear the word boundary, boundary, boundary forever. But do we ever really think accurately about what it's a boundary to and from? So if you notice that there's an over or under reaction, then by definition, there's been a trigger, right? So if there's been a trigger, the trigger is always something really simple. It is always something you saw or something you heard, maybe something you felt. But it's information coming to the senses. So it's not you're being an arsehole, right? It's you left your coffee cup on the table that I just cleaned up. So triggers are really specific, and the more specific you can get with them, the easier it is to do this thing called a boundary. So a boundary is really just a way of trying to manage triggers in your environment, but for who? Who are you managing boundaries for? You're managing boundaries for your dysregulation. So a boundary should never be an imposition on another person. It should be a declaration of self-care, if I can put it like that. Quite often we're tempted to say, it's all your fault, you've come across my boundaries. But really what's happened is I've failed to take subsequent action to make sure my boundaries stay in place for me. If that makes sense. So if you do successfully mediate your boundaries, you might take this down from a 3 out of 10 to maybe a 1 out of 10. It's still going to hit your baggage, your unfinished business, something very similar to this in the past, or something similar to this 1,000 times in the past. And you might have a kind of 6 out of 10 reaction here, which is improvement. We've gone from 3 to 9 to 3 to 6. So what else could we do? Here's another blue line stopping my reaction going all the way out. What would you call that? Gatekeeping, there you go. Anything else? Any other suggestions? Self-restraint. A container. Yeah, I call this containment. I mean, it's really just a boundary in reverse. Right? There's nothing particularly complicated about this. But if you call it containment, then you know that you're talking about containing something in rather than keeping something out. So the idea here is that, let's say I'm now down to a 6 out of 10 reaction. I can somehow turn that into a 3 out of 10 reaction. And what does that look like in the real world? Any suggestions? Self-talk. Self-talk? Well, here's an example. Instead of calling you an arsehole, I could say, I feel like calling you an arsehole. Right? Do you see the difference? So this takes, yeah, but this takes a desire to do it and then a little bit of vigilance. So if you're already in a 9 out of 10, you're not going to do it. Right? You're just going to go around calling people arseholes all day long. But if you manage to keep some lid on it, you might have a chance. The advantage is what you end up with, of course, is 3 out of 10 into the system, 3 out of 10 out of the system. And notice you don't have 9 out of 10 coming out, and you don't have 0 out of 10 coming out. So you're actually simulating a perfect nervous system. Now, what's the point of doing this? Survive? Well, yeah, maybe. It depends what context you're in. But really, we can come back to my earlier story. What is the point of going to a 12-step meeting? Regulation. Regulation is a word that we now use and we understand a lot. Regulation is really about managing the dysregulation or the bad baggage in the nervous system. What happens in a 12-step meeting? Do we have boundaries? Yes. There's a very regulated format for how we can talk and what people can say at us. Right? People can't really say anything at us. In the meetings that I'm familiar with, there's this idea that you really can't comment on other people's stuff. Right? So it's very boundaried. It's like, you go around and turn, people don't interrupt, and people don't talk about you. And is there containment? Can you just do and say anything you want? No. So it's a way of experiencing other nervous systems near you without getting triggered, but without losing connection. Right? So you neither have to shut down, nor do you have to explode. And in that middle place, you can achieve this thing called co-regulation, where nervous systems actually settle because they have safe intimacy. So what happens if you fail with your boundaries or with your containment? Let's see what happens if you fail with your containment. What happens if you just call the person an arsehole instead of acknowledging that you think you feel like they're an arsehole? Well, I think it's like a soap bubble. So if you put a pinprick in it, the whole thing evaporates. And you might notice this, that if you lose your temper with someone, you no longer have the capacity to really, in the moment, know what's okay for you and what isn't okay for you. Because that's really what a boundary is. What's okay for my nervous system? What isn't okay for my nervous system? What do I need to do about it? So these two things, I think, go together. And the advantage of doing it well is that you can begin to build what I would call an internal set of boundaries and containment around your baggage. And that's the third piece of work. So the third piece of work is starting to do work with the somatic, with the body. So all the things that people now talk about are working with body-based psychologies actually require someone to be stable enough and safe enough and contained enough and boundaried enough to do that. So when people come into residential therapy, they kind of get that in spades from the building. But when people have to do this for themselves outpatient, that has to be something they build for themselves. So this idea again of you can stay sober as long as you don't drink between meetings. If you're beginning to lose your boundaries, lose your containment, go to an environment where that's modeled for you, and you'll take a little bit of that on the inside. Now this is also a model of attachment. So this is what a mother or caregiver does for a child. So you can see that that is the idea. So if this is the case, then you can go from this person, right? If you zoom all the way back from that picture, it looks exactly like this person. You notice that? Anyone baffled by that? I wish I had a better graphic here. We could just zoom out. Imagine me zooming out, you end up there. So the trick to being regulated is actually to begin to simulate regulation, and then you might internally, organically catch up with it, as you notice people do if they keep going to meetings. Eventually, something shifts on the inside and they feel better. Now, you can do something to accelerate that somatic work, but the key thing is that the body already knows what to do. So the reptile and the mammal brain have been doing this for about 100 million years without your help, and they still know how to do it. What you need to do is get yourself out of the way. That's the key thing to working with the nervous system, is actually to educate the prefrontal cortex to get out of the way of the system that already knows what it's doing. Now, on that topic, wouldn't it be useful, therefore, to be able to measure regulation live during a session to see if you could bring a person out of dysregulation into regulation? Please say yes. Thank you. So it turns out that a man called Stephen Porges, who's one of the great experts at the nervous system, has invented a device which can measure the nervous system using nothing more than a camera. And this first laboratory prototype that's ever been allowed out of the laboratory is on this table in front of you right now. What I would love for my magic trick is a willing volunteer. I have a volunteer here. So what I'm going to ask you to do is bring up something which has dysregulated you recently. Can you do that?
Yes.
You have something?
Yes.
Come on up. There we go. What's your name?
Aisha.
Aisha. Nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet
Can you sit here?
Yes.
Now, I'm going to turn this on, and then we're going to fiddle with the microphone and things. And I'm just hoping this is going to work. Would you do me a favour and just look at that camera until I sit down? And I'm hoping that this is going to pick it out of that background. It's not... there you go, yeah, just keep looking at that camera. And what I'm going to do is, while you do that, I'm going to give you this mic, and I'm going to use that handheld mic. So, it takes about 2 minutes just to set up, so nothing's really happening yet. Can I just pin
yes.
this on your...
Yes, please.
whatever this thing's called. And if I just lift up your arm. Thank you. Okay, so... Aisha, can you... you can probably now just look at me if you like.
Okay.
So tell me what has come up that has dysregulated you in the last 24, 48 hours.
I was walking and I was hit by a cyclist from the back,
Okay.
fell flat on my face,
Okay.
and broke a tooth.
No, that's terrible.
Yes.
Right. Well, this is a pretty big trigger.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a real thing in the
Yeah.
here and now.
Yeah.
So, what did you do next? How did you react to this?
I was in shock. I didn't really know what happened, and I think I was just there on the floor. I didn't even have a chance to, you know, like if I had known it was coming, I would have put my hands out,
Sure.
but I didn't have a chance to react. I just
Right.
went flat, and I was stunned. So people came and they helped me up, and then the first thing I noticed was that I had blood on my shirt and my mouth, and you know, touched it, and so it was like again in shock.
Yeah.
And then, you know, I felt like I didn't have the tooth, like I swallowed something, so I had actually swallowed my tooth. And the cyclist just went off.
Right.
So yeah, so I had to rush to the dentist and get the rest of it extracted.
Okay.
He glued on a fake tooth, and yeah, so it was quite traumatic.
So let me ask you about how you feel about the cyclist going away.
Very angry.
Yeah.
I felt, you know, like, you fucking asshole. And
Yeah.
there was a part of
It's
me
okay. Let's hear it.
that,
Yeah.
and I just felt like, you know, what is this? Like, there's no sense of responsibility. And my dentist was saying that maybe the businesses close by have CCTV and you can go and ask.
So let me
them.
take you back to the
Yes.
cyclist. If he had stayed, what would you have said to him?
I mean, it depends if he was apologetic.
Okay, just your initial instinct, what would it have been?
You need to pay for
Yeah,
this.
yeah, okay.
Yeah,
so there
because-
would have been a strong reaction at
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And how does it feel to think about being allowed to have that expression?
That
That
if
was
I was
denied to you, yeah.
Yeah, if I was actually able to say
Yeah.
it, I think I would have felt relief.
So how does it feel right now
How
to
does it
conjure
feel?
up this image of him staying and you being able to tell him, give him quite a strong reaction? I mean, this is not a 3 out of 10 problem. This is maybe
Yeah.
a 6 out of 10.
Yeah,
So you had a reaction you wanted to give voice to, or to really give body to,
yeah.
and it would have been about a 6 out of 10.
Yeah, I would have just said, you know, this is just the height of irresponsibility. First of all, you went past me, you didn't even stop. Second of all, you were on the footpath. You were supposed to be on the goddamn road. And then, you know, now this is going to cost me 2,500 euros, which I don't have. So you need to pay for this. Like, you need to take responsibility for
Now,
this.
that sounds like a pretty measured response,
Yeah.
pretty boundaried response.
Yeah.
What would you have said if you had not been so measured?
Smacked him
Yeah,
once.
there you go. See, so there's part of your body response. So you notice there's all these different responses.
Yeah.
They're actually coming from those different parts of your brain.
Yeah.
There's a part of your brain that wants to complete your response to this threat by smacking him one.
And smashing his cycle.
Smashing his cycle, great strategy.
And then jumping on it,
Jumping on
breaking
it,
it apart,
feel it. Yeah.
taking parts of it,
Yes.
taking the handle, stuffing it down his neck.
Yes.
Should I go on?
Yes. Definitely. This is definitely helping. Yeah. See,
I
nice
feel
sigh.
like my blood pressure is rising as I
Yes,
talk about
that's
it.
okay. Let
Yeah.
it rise. Let the body do what it wants to do. The body
Yeah.
knows what it needs to do
Yeah.
to recover from this event. Right? So interestingly, let's assume you've done all these things and you then reflect on this a week and a half later as you receive a visit from the constabulary
Yeah.
asking you to explain your actions on the day.
Yeah.
And you look back on that and do you think this was the right response, the appropriate response?
Well, given the fact that we live in a society with rules, and an officer has now shown up at my door, so it's like
There might be a reason for that. Is that, you know,
Yeah.
this guy might have just made a mistake and it's an
Yeah.
accident, and you know. So, and just, you know, because what I'm trying to tease out here is what it feels like is a reaction to something that has happened before this event, as well as what has happened during this event.
Yeah, well, what happened was that I felt like I wasn't in control. And there was a part of me that was actually feeling like feeling very helpless. That even
Okay,
my
so
body didn't know what to do.
As you're sitting here talking about feeling helpless, what do you notice in your body?
Fear.
Do you notice any sensation in your body right now? Any place in your body that you notice sensation?
Right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in my heart.
Okay, so kind of here?
Yeah, here, and it goes down my left arm.
Okay, down your left arm.
Yeah.
So what do you feel down the left arm there?
A tightness and
Tightness.
tingling.
Okay. What colour is it?
Green.
And what temperature is it?
99.9 Fahrenheit degrees.
Right, so really hot green tingling in your left arm. And if you just spend a moment with that, I'm not going to take you too deep into this, but just spend a moment with that. And think about doing a thing that I might call time traveling. So take the sensation back in time. Not the story, but the sensation. And just see what comes to mind, if anything.
This sensation of feeling.
Yeah, the sensation in the arm, the very hot green sensation goes back in time. See where this takes you back to. And the audience will probably notice that there's a indication on the physio cam that says taking you back to something more dysregulating than talking to me. If you don't want to talk about it, it's okay, because I know we're in an audience here. It's taking you somewhere, isn't it? Do you want to talk about it, or do you want to keep it to yourself?
Actually, I thought of several incidences and different stages of my life.
Would be fair to call that like a stack of pancakes. So the time traveling goes one and then another and then another and then another. They're all examples of your nervous system not finishing a response to threat in the same channel, I'm suggesting. Is there any one of those that you'd feel safe to talk about?
Not really.
Okay, that's fine. It's really great. That's a great boundary right there. I would give you a round of applause if I had a free hand. But you notice that, there, thank you very much. So it's quite interesting because, sorry to interrupt our connection, but I'm just also trying to demonstrate the technology here. That we've been holding you in quite a regulated place, and then I invited you into your somatic dysregulation, and it took you back somewhere. Then I kind of gave you permission not to go with it, and you sort of came back to here and now, and that actually registered on the equipment. So what I'd like you to do, without telling the story, I want you to just go to one of the earlier examples, and I want you to stay there somatically, and just see if you can notice any change in the sensation in your body. So you're going back to the sensation. Maybe it's that hot green arm, back to a place in time. And I'm curious.